My Mother, The Person and the Patient is an original podcast written and hosted by me, Fatuma Kuso. This podcast is about my mother, Timira Abdussamid Mohammed, Ayaya we call her, and that's the Somali word for grandmother, and her great-grandchildren call her Ayaya too, and that is their way of saying great-grandmother. If you are a caregiver who chooses to keep their loved one at home, whether you are at the beginning of your journey as a caregiver, in the middle, or towards the end, at least based on my experience in Ontario, one of the greatest challenges in that journey is finding a caregiver to either give you a respite, a break, to get coffee for a couple hours, to do grocery shopping, to go out to dinner with family or friends, to take a nap, to rest, to go to a work function, or you are trying to get away for a weekend and you're willing to pay for this care, to find somebody that will step in on your stead in that constant demand of caregiving is quite challenging. As I record this episode is Thursday, August the 31st. And this coming weekend, which is a Labor Day weekend, my beautiful niece is getting married and I need to be away for that wedding. As you know, the weddings are organized and decided and determined their day months or sometimes years in advance. So I knew this day was coming and extremely excited to be part of this beautiful day for my niece and the rest of my family. So I planned and made an arrangement with somebody to come in months in advance, but when the week came where I was supposed to meet with this person and train them and show them how things are done around the house, that person all of a sudden, they had something else come in and that fell through. And I moved to the next person in my list. That person agreed. And just this past week, that person said, I can't do this unless you pay me X number of dollars, even though we agreed on an amount that I could afford to pay, and they were feeling comfortable in accepting to compensate their time. But I received this text message saying that unless you're willing to pay me X amount of dollars, I can't come. This had irked me in two ways. Number one, this person and I had discussed the payment, came to an agreement which I thought was something we could both live. And that person didn't say at the time, I can't take this, or this is not enough, or I want this amount. But they came up with amount, I came up with amount, and we decided that we are going to meet in middle ground and have that agreement. But the person decided, and I can't really fault them for changing their mind, except it puts me in a bind now to find somebody else to come in their stead when there's only 3 days left before I am to depart. I am scrambling to find somebody to come in and take care of my mother and step in my shoes and become the constant caregiver. But I am taking deep breaths and bringing myself to a place where I accept these kind of things would happen, even though it never fails to rattle me. It never fails to throw me off my balance and make me feel like, what is going on here, and get me to question my ability to do what I need to do and take part in the family activities that I so much want to take part. But even then, as the last 11 years of being a caregiver to my mother and facing these challenges on weekly and monthly and daily and hourly basis, services that are being canceled, services that could not be filled, service times that changed, I learned to accept the fact that things will almost always change and not work out in the way I thought they should work out or I want them to work out. But I am reminding myself to continue to breathe and know things, even though they might not work the way I thought they should work, things would always work out. And in that acceptance, I gain some form of peace. And that has made all the difference. When you listen to how we arrived at my mother's diagnosis and what followed, it's so easy to see her just as the patient, to see her as nothing more than the disease that reduced her to shell of her old self. But I want to also to tell you about my mother, the person, the fierce woman that told her stories unapologetically, celebrating the beautiful parts and harsh realities equally. I want to share with you the stories she told us about her life as a girl growing up in a small village, the tales that marked her adulthood. I want to share with you all her losses and the ultimate winnings. The following chapter is one of those stories reconstructed from my childhood memory. Upon hearing the news, the Habo and the other women in the group gathered in Timira's house. They intended to mourn the loss of their friendship, but soon they stared at her, listening to the crazy story about Beit Abo. They knew she'd lost her mother and brother as a girl. The Haba was the only person who knew her brother was murdered and her mother died soon after. But even she didn't know the gruesome details. They ate him? One of the women asked upon hearing the story. Yes, Timira could tell they didn't believe her. That's what they were charged with, she added as she saw the same doubts that filled her appear on their faces. She didn't blame them for feeling that way. How could she? She didn't fully understand it herself. Was it proven? One of the women asked. Everyone in the room turned to Timiro, waiting, expectant. Perhaps they wanted her to put their mind at ease, to offer them something tangible. They were executed. Timiro gave an answer that didn't respond to the question, for she had no words to put their inquiry to rest. Over the years, the accused mother's claim that they were not animals to eat a child echoed in her mind. She tried to push the thought out of her head. She couldn't sympathize with the evil that took her brother and paved the way for her mother's untimely departure. But she knew her efforts were futile. Before leaving that dusty, makeshift court where the judge condemned the two to death, and her father's response to the judge, "They are executed, then what?" only added to the feeling of her uncertainty. As if her words shocked them, a deafening silence overtook the gathering. It was a long time before the Habo cleared her throat. "Let us help Timira pack this house." She broke the silence, figured out what she needs and who could do what. Relieved to be away from that terrible story, the woman began speaking all at once. Their chatter lifted the spirit of the room. Within minutes of her speaking, the Haba moved at full speed, assigning tasks to different people. 3 women agreed to make otka, meat cut into small pieces, cooked and soaked in butter. 2 other women got the job to gather all the clothing to be washed, folded and wrapped in a large gray tarp provided by the military. 4 women were to organize the housewares into large boxes for the men to load them into the truck. When her father and stepmother arrived 3 days before she was to move, Timira was grateful Farah didn't come with them. She didn't need a double reminder of their shared loss. It was bad enough that her father was there. "My father and stepmother are here," Timira whispered to her husband when he came back from work that afternoon. She'd asked Mohammed not to send for her family until after the move. If she must go and face the horror that was Abu, no need to subject her father to reliving the pain. She didn't want to dredge the painful memory that corroded every cell in her body. I thought we agreed not to let them know, Timira hissed at her husband. We can't move without telling your family. Mohammed had promised her father to protect her, and taking her from one city to another without telling him was out of the question. Knowing I'm returning to that city will make him sad. Her anger toward her husband subsided with that statement. So will he if we move without telling him. Muhammad was right, and Timur knew it. Still, her father's presence brought up the fear of Beit Abu she'd worked so hard to breast down. Timiro, I know you're worried about returning to Beit Abu. Her father took her hand in his and looked at her directly. But this is not the same city as when we were there. You will not live in a desolate camp like we did. Worried was an understatement. She was petrified. Timira wanted to believe her father about the difference accommodations might make, except the protection living in a military base might provide as a barrier against the evil that destroyed her family. She even closed her eyes and tried to envision her safe surroundings. But all she could see behind her sealed lids was the evil that inhabited the place. Nothing would get to you or your children behind all that military power. Timira wanted the certainty with which her father spoke to give her a tiny ray of hope that she wouldn't encounter those terrible people. Guards are ensuring that the base remains safe and secure at all times. You are right, she said, despite the uncertainty and apprehension that suffocated her. She knew her father was the only one who understood how she felt, for they shared the tragedy from the beginning to the end. I know you're scared. Her stepmother wasn't going to sugarcoat anything. But you go with your husband no matter what. That's what family does. Timira appreciated her stepmother's bluntness. You are not alone. You have a husband now. Her father's statement didn't ring true because her mother had a husband in him and he loved her as much a man could love a woman. Still, he couldn't protect her, not any more than Muhammad could protect Timiro. I know, Abu. She forced a smile to show her father that she was feeling comforted. She did that more for his benefit than for her. If she could go back to Beit Abu and survive it, it would not only help her, but also give her father the relief that there is a chance that his family would find peace. She reassured her father she was at home with going to Beit Abu. Still, he kept the next 3 days reminding her that she would be safe, while Fatima told her that her duty was to keep her family together despite her fear of the city. We will visit you as soon as you're settled, her father said, and Fatima agreed. So will we, the Hafiz said, and all the other members of the group, men and women repeated after her. Until you get tired of us, the Hafiz has been shouted somewhere among the men loading the truck. Her father, stepmother, and the Habu and the rest of her friends stayed with Timiro and her family for the entirety of the moving day. They brought food, helped load the truck, checked and rechecked the house, and spoke cheerfully. This continued until Timiro, carrying her son, followed her husband, Ruqya, in his arms into the truck. She waved at them once and looked away. She couldn't bear to look at her parents and friends as the truck pulled her away from everything that mattered. From the moment she sat down until they arrived in Invaluable, Timira avoided the windows. She didn't want to see anything that reminded her of the horrors she'd experienced on her way to that city and back. She didn't want to risk seeing the horrible market where the so-called court proceedings took place, and a sports field where the execution occurred. She worked so hard to forget these places that haunted her waking hours. It was bad enough that she couldn't erase the camp from her mind. The image of the lonely place where she'd lost half her family was imprinted in her mind. To behold them again, she dared not. Timiro gathered enough courage to look her new home after they arrived at the military base. Her father was right. They had to go through various security checkpoints, although they were on a military-owned vehicle. Under the constant gaze of watchtowers positioned around the perimeter, she saw a sprawling complex of small buildings and structures on a flat land, surrounded by dusty, sun-baked hills, rows of barracks, training grounds and equipment storage areas lined up on either side of the gravel road they traveled. The driver turned left as the truck approached three large structures Timiro later found out were mess hall, washing, and medical facilities. Madam, a man addressed Timiro as soon as the truck came to stop. Timiro looked up to make sure he was addressing her. The man bowed slightly when they locked gaze before extending a hand toward her. Madam, he said again. Nobody had ever addressed her as madam, so she didn't know how to respond to such a gesture. She and the man stared at each other, the air around them thick with tension, until her husband appeared next to the man. Here, Mohammed lifted the baby off her lap and handed the child to the man. Timiro lunged to grab her son back. She didn't have enough time to act because the man descended the steps by the time she got up. She followed him, going down the ladder 2 steps at a time, calling for the man to give her child back. Abdul Qadir must have sensed the fear because he was crying when she reached him. Someone wants their mother, the man said. Someone wants their mother, the man said, placing her wailing son in her arms. Timiro exhaled a breath she didn't know she was holding and followed her husband and daughter into their new home. My Mother, the Person and the Patient can be found in Amazon Music, Apple Podcast, or wherever you get your podcasts. Please remember to follow, like, and share, and join me next week as I share with you another episode of my mother's journey as both the person and the patient. Thank you.